It was meant to be a union that would silence wars. A wedding forged not from love but from bloodland and centuries of fragile treaties dangling by a thread. The 14th century in Eastern Europe was a time of crumbling empires and sharpened daggers behind royal smiles. Borders shifted like tides, and every marriage between noble houses wasn't a celebration, it was a negotiation, sealed in lace gold and veiled threats. The House of Varnava, one of the region's oldest dynasties, had long sat on a strategic stretch of land, fertile, fortified, and envied. Their line was ancient, tied to legends, saints, and conquerors, but age had withered its power. Their army was thin, their coffers strained, and worst of all, their bloodline hung by a thread, a single heir, Lord Miklos Varnava, barely 20, groomed from birth to inherit the weight of a fading crown. When word spread that he would take a bride from the wealthy expansionist House of Kiliman, it was clear this wedding wasn't just a family affair. It was a last desperate gamble to anchor a dynasty already halfway in its grave. The Kelimans came in glittering processions, carriages lined with crimson velvet, dozens of nobles' mercenaries disguised as guests, and trunks of silk dowry. The bride, Lady Catelyn Keliman, was a porcelain doll, wrapped in whispers, barely 17, said to be beautiful in that tragic doomed way some noble daughters were born. Some said she cried the entire journey. Others claimed she arrived laughing, draped in emeralds, already carrying a hidden blade sewn into her hem. The venue chosen was the ancestral seat of the Varnavas, a brooding fortress deep in the Carpathians, wrapped in fog and surrounded by black pines. Castle Dragomir had not hosted a wedding in nearly 60 years. Its halls were built for war, not joy. Banners were hastily unfurled, torches lit, rats flushed from the great dining chamber. An entire month's harvest was slaughtered. Ovens roared day and night, preparing a feast to stun every count and emissary attending. The wine, rare, honey-thick, imported from the Dalmatian coast, arrived in sealed barrels under armed guard. Outside, the countryside simmered with resentment. Locals whispered that the gods would never bless such a union. Old wives scratched symbols into their doors. The last time Dragomir Castle held a feast, they said it ended in plague. And now, as torchlight danced across rain-slicked stones and guests poured in by the hundreds, an ill wind stirred the pine trees like a warning. But no one listened. Not when the gold was this bright. Not when alliances this fragile were at stake. Inside, the great hall had been transformed into a temple of decadence. Black swans floated in artificial ponds. A quartet of blind harpers played dirges that no one recognized. Tables groaned under roasted, boar-spiced venison. Candied figs and towers of marzipan molded into grotesque family crests. And at the head of it all sat Miklos and Catelyn Young, pale, silent, surrounded by lords who smiled too wide and bishops who drank too deeply. Toasts were made in every direction, to the gods, to peace, to the end of conflict between the houses. Goblets clinked like distant bells of doom. The air smelled of roast flesh and roses crushed underfoot. One servant, young and wide-eyed, later said he saw Lady Catelyn flinch when the first toast was raised. Another swore a rat burst into the hall and no one moved to stop it. Beneath the laughter, a tension pulsed like a heartbeat. There were too many guards. Too many sealed boxes arriving late. A noblewoman from the southern territories leaned to her husband and whispered, "It feels like we're being watched." And in truth, they were by hundreds of flickering candle eyes, by unseen figures in the corridors above, and perhaps by something older, darker buried beneath Dragomir's cold foundations. Then, just past the 9th course, the doors opened once more. A final guest had arrived. His face was veiled, his clothes foreign. He carried a small iron chest locked with 3 seals. No one admitted to inviting him, and yet none dared question him. He was seated at the edge of the hall near the wine barrels. And for the first time that night, the harper's song faltered. The goblets were filled again. A final toast was raised to the future of House Varnava, to the eternal bond now sealed in holy matrimony. No one knew it then, but that toast would be their last. The poison had already begun to work. The goblets were raised, their gilded rims catching the flicker of chandelier firelight. Crimson wine shimmered like lifeblood poured with ceremonial precision by trembling hands. Dozens of nobles stood, some drunk with celebration, others drunk with dread, and shouted in unison, "To the Union!" Then they drank. It began almost imperceptibly. A slight twitch, a blink held too long. One guest, a baron from the southern frontier, dropped his cup, clutching his stomach with a puzzled laugh. Moments later, he was hunched over, retching violently into a silver basin. Another countess stood to offer him help, only to collapse her head, striking the corner of a marble column with a sound that silenced the room. The silence didn't last. As the seconds ticked by, more guests began to falter, at first discreetly, then with grotesque urgency. A nobleman vomited a black tar-like substance onto the feast table. Another began to scream shrill and animalistic, clawing at her throat as her eyes rolled back. Her silk gown bloomed red as blood began to pour from her nostrils, her ears, the corners of her mouth. And then she too fell. The servants tried to maintain order. They whispered reassurances and fetched water, though their hands trembled with growing horror. One steward attempted to call for a physician, but was cut short. His words gurgled into a choking gasp as he collapsed to the ground, twitching. Panic, once contained to murmurs and sidelong glances, exploded into chaos. Screams bounced off stone walls. Guests pushed and shoved, trampling gowns and spilling wine. A young squire leapt from the balcony in a frenzy, shattering bones as he crashed below. Several nobles collapsed in clusters, tangled in the folds of their own robes. Those closest to the wine barrels were the first to perish. Some still clutched their goblets as they convulsed, eyes wide with terror, tongues blackened and swollen. The bride, Lady Catelyn, stood frozen at the high table, her skin pale as frost. Her mouth moved, but no sound came. Her father rushed to her, shouting her name, but she collapsed into his arms just as he reached her, blood streaming from her eyes like tears. A moment later, he too stiffened, spasmed violently, and fell backward, knocking over a towering centerpiece of roasted pheasant. Lord Maclaw staggered to his feet. His face was a mask of confusion and agony. He looked out across the banquet hall, once a stage of celebration, now a theater of the damned. Blood smeared the floors. Bodies jerked in final spasms. The air was thick with the stink of vomit, iron, and death. He opened his mouth as if to speak, and instead vomited a torrent of red-black fluid that sprayed across the table. His legs buckled. He died alone, slumped over his bride's lifeless form. By now the hall was unrecognizable. Tapestries had been torn down in desperate attempts to cover the dying. The music had stopped long ago. Fires sputtered in their sconces, casting monstrous shadows over twisted corpses. Some guests, too weak to move, muttered prayers with their final breaths. Others, seized by madness, laughed as they clawed at their own skin, trying to peel away the pain. The guards attempted to seal the exits, but it was already too late. The poison moved faster than any alchemist could understand. It didn't discriminate. Noble servants, even the castle hounds that had licked from discarded plates, all fell. One guard who hadn't drunk the wine tried to flee, only to find the main gates had been barred from the outside. Witnesses would later speak of the smell, the acrid, rotting stench of death that clung to the very stones. They spoke of the silence that followed, heavy and unnatural, as if the castle itself were mourning or watching. By dawn, the great hall of Dragomir was a morgue. Over 40 lay dead. Another dozen would succumb by midday. Blood pooled around golden plates. Rats returned to gnaw on the forgotten feast. The food, untouched, still steamed in the corners of the room. A scribe, one of the few survivors, would later write, "The wedding of peace became a wedding of ruin. God did not attend that feast. Only death dined with us that night, but the horror didn't end with the dead. It had only begun. The castle's towering gates were bolted shut. No one in, no one out. Inside, Dragomir reeked of sweet wine and fresh death. Those who had survived the first wave of the poisoning stumbled through the blood-slicked corridors, dazed and broken. Some wept beside their dead children. Others sat in silent shock, rocking back and forth in corners, hands stained red to the wrist. The feast had turned into a mass graveyard, and no one yet knew why or how. By midday, the castle's keep was converted into a crude infirmary. Local physicians and monks were summoned their robes, dragging through bile and wine as they worked without answers. Alchemists arrived too, summoned from distant courts carrying their brass instruments and vials of pungent herbs. Their diagnosis was swift and horrifying. This was no accidental illness, no plague, no spoiled meat. It was deliberate, coordinated, a perfectly timed orchestration of death. The wine had been the weapon. Each goblet had held not only fermented grapes and honeyed spice, but a cocktail of poisons so potent, so precisely measured that it defied belief. Arsenic, wolfsbane, perhaps even crushed belladonna or powdered toadstool. Traces of something unfamiliar were found clinging to the insides of cups, a strange black sediment that smelled of iron and rot. The symptoms, too, were beyond ordinary poison. Victims had bled from pores. Some screamed about burning eyes or invisible hands choking them. Others were found with twisted limbs as if their muscles had seized in their final seconds. One alchemist insisted it was a new kind of venom, an alchemical brew never before seen in Europe, possibly drawn from Eastern knowledge or ancient Roman texts. Another whispered that the toxin responded to heat and light-changing form as it entered the body. No one agreed on what it was, but all agreed on one thing: it had been crafted with intent. This was no kitchen accident. The servants were the first to be questioned. The ones who hadn't drunk from the same barrels were beaten, tortured, dragged before nobles desperate for someone to blame. One cook confessed under duress to seeing unfamiliar wine casks delivered just before the ceremony. They bore no crest, no seal, only wax thick and cracked, as if melted, then reapplied. He'd asked the cellarmaster about them, but the man had simply nodded and returned to the shadows. That cellarmaster would never be found. Worse still, a gap was discovered in the inventory records. 3 casks unaccounted for. 2 had been tapped during the toast. The third was missing entirely. Panic turned to paranoia. Survivors suspected one another. Who had ordered the wine? Who had been spared? Who hadn't drunk at all? Then came the list. A chamberlain, grim-faced and shaking, delivered it to the castle steward. A hastily scribbled guest ledger. Of the 80 names expected at the feast, 9 were marked absent, among them a neighboring duke who had long opposed the union, a merchant with ties to the Kellerman's political rivals, a priest who had argued against the marriage on moral grounds. None had sent apologies. None had fallen ill. The poison, it seemed, had purpose and precision. Survivors began to whisper about the stranger, the veiled guest who had arrived late bearing the iron chest. No one knew his name. No one had seen his face. He was seated near the wine, then vanished in the chaos. His chest, when found, had been pried open with a dagger. Empty. Another servant came forward, terrified, claiming she had seen that same figure days earlier, lurking in the castle cellars, speaking to the cellarmaster in hushed tones. She hadn't thought anything of it until now. Her testimony would be her last. She was found dead 2 days later, hanging in her quarters, a faint scent of almonds lingering in the air. Even the dogs wouldn't touch her body. Rumors bloomed like fungus in the rot. Some believed the poison had been placed by a rival family, an attempt to cripple the Varnava bloodline before it could merge with the powerful Kellermans. Others suspected religious zealots furious at the wedding's violation of sacred tradition. A few began to whisper of something worse, that the poison had not come from men at all, but from something older. In the great chapel, a priest, one of the few left alive, locked himself in, claiming to have received a vision. He painted symbols across the altar in his own blood, chanting of serpents and the wine that thinks. He was found dead the next morning, eyes removed, tongue bitten through. What began as a noble wedding had become a riddle written in corpses. Every answer unearthed only led to more questions. There were no clear suspects, no surviving masterminds, no trail of money, no ransom. Just the cold, calculated murder of a generation of nobles. And a third cask still unaccounted for. Dragomir Castle was no longer a royal seat. It was a trap. A puzzle box of death. And somewhere inside its stone belly, a murderer had walked free, leaving behind only stained screams and silence. By the end of the 3rd day, the snow outside Dragomir Castle was stained with blood, where bodies had been dragged out and laid in rows. What began as a royal celebration had left behind the decaying remains of one of Europe's most prominent bloodlines, House Varnava. The ruling family for nearly 200 years was obliterated in less than 24 hours. Their banners still hung from the ramparts, fluttering in the wind like mocking funeral shrouds. There were no surviving sons, no cousins of age, no nephews to inherit the family crest. Even the illegitimate lines had been wiped out. Bastards and barons alike had all drunk from the same cups, swallowed the same poison, danced the same death. In a world where lineage was law, the extinction of a house wasn't just tragic, it was apocalyptic. The political fallout was instantaneous. Neighboring houses, once allies, descended like vultures. The lands once held by the Varnavas were now disputed territory, a bloody chessboard where every piece moved at once. Fortresses that had stood untouched for generations were seized within days. Vassals changed allegiance overnight. Mercenaries were hired, borders redrawn, and armies marched under the banner of stability, though everyone knew it was conquest dressed as duty. Inside the walls of Dragomir, the mood curdled into hysteria. Survivors, the few who hadn't touched the wine or who had vomited fast enough to live, were placed under guard, not for protection but containment. Some were seen talking to the dead. Others sat in trance-like silence, their minds cracked under the weight of what they had seen. One young nobleman spared, only because he had arrived late, reportedly clawed at his own face and screamed that their souls are still dancing. They won't stop. The funerals were hurried and grim. There were too many bodies to bury with dignity, and too few hands left to do it. Priests refused to hold mass for the dead, claiming they had been tainted. Bodies were burned in mass pyres near the forest's edge, where the smoke curled black into the sky for days. The screams of mourning families were drowned out by the crackling of bone and flesh. Some of the victims could not be moved. Their bodies had twisted into grotesque shapes, fingers fused to goblets' mouths, frozen mid-scream limbs, locked in postures no living person could imitate. One bishop, overcome with horror, declared that the dead should be sealed within the castle itself. "Let the halls become their tomb," he whispered. "Let the stones remember." No royal tombs were prepared. No cathedrals rang bells in honor. The massacre was too complete, too monstrous. The bloodline did not simply die, it was erased. With the Varnavas gone, House Kelemen fared no better. Half of their delegation had perished at the feast. The others returned to their homeland, to find revolt waiting for them. Peasants whispered of a cursed bride who brought death in her dowry. The Kelemen's own allies began to distance themselves, fearful of being next. Within months, their rule collapsed into civil war. Their holdings fractured, their name so stained with death that future generations would strike it from family trees. Among the lower classes, folklore blossomed in the vacuum. Some believed the bloodline had been cursed for defying old gods buried beneath Dragomir. Others said the nobles were punished for centuries of cruelty. One tale passed from mother to child in hushed tones, claimed that the bride was never alive at all, that her heart had stopped. The moment she stepped inside the castle and her corpse had simply waited for the poison to catch up. Merchants refused to pass near Dragomir. The forest paths grew wild again. Hunters who entered the woods surrounding the castle often never returned. One who did stagger out weeks later was covered in scratches and spoke in riddles. He died days later, choking on his own blood while muttering, "The wine pours itself. The cups are never empty." At court, kings and queens who once sought alliances with the Varnavas now spoke of them only in private. Their disappearance was too dramatic, too terrifying. And though no one dared say it publicly, there was an undercurrent of something darker fear. Not of rebellion or war, but of repetition. What happened at Dragomir could happen again. The incident sent shockwaves across Europe. In France, royal weddings were postponed. In Hungary, food tasters became mandatory. In Poland, a noble family famously drank only water for 6 months after attending a feast. The ritual of the royal toast, a centuries-old tradition, was suddenly a moment of dread. The bloodline was gone, but the fear remained. Some said House Varnava died in a single night. But the truth was more haunting. Their death stretched on for years in shadows and whispers and curses and nightmares. The family name disappeared from official records. Portraits were burned, seals shattered. Some even suggested the crown had played a part in the erasure, eager to prevent the horror from becoming legend. But legends have a way of surviving, especially the ones soaked in wine and blood. The blood hadn't dried before the rumors began. Whispers wormed their way through the court like parasites feeding on fear, suspicion, and the gaping silence left by the dead. Who had done it? Who stood to gain from such a precise and monstrous massacre? A royal feast turned to execution. This wasn't madness. It was strategy. At first the servants were the target of investigation, but they were pawns burned, buried, or broken. Attention shifted to those who had not attended. There were 9. 9 names written on the guest list who never stepped foot into Dragomir Castle that night. No excuses, no apologies. Among them were 2 regional dukes known to oppose the Varnava-Kellerman alliance, a bishop rumored to favor a rival noble house, and, most damning of all, a cousin of Lady Catilin's own bloodline, Lord Janos Kellerman, exiled after a failed inheritance dispute. He hadn't been seen in years. But weeks before the wedding, a man fitting his description had been spotted traveling near Dragomir in a caravan of foreign physicians and entertainers. A detail so strange it was nearly dismissed until survivors recalled the veiled man at the wedding. No name, no invitation, and a locked iron chest that by dawn was found empty. Was the feast a carefully engineered vendetta? A reckoning disguised as celebration? Then there was the wine. 3 barrels foreign and unmarked had arrived the day before the wedding. No crest, no papers. And yet they were approved for service over the objections of the head steward, who vanished hours before the toast began. It was later discovered that the shipment order bore a falsified seal forged so expertly it fooled the castle's record keepers. When the ink was tested, it showed traces of crushed beetle shell, a technique used by forgers from the Venetian underworld. Who had the power to coordinate such a deception? Who had access to the guest list, the wine stores, the kitchen, and the heralds? Suspicions bloomed in every direction. Some pointed at the bride's family. Perhaps the Kellermans had sought to absorb Varnava lands entirely by wiping out the groom's line and inheriting the spoils through Lady Catilin. But if that were true, why would Catilin herself drink the poison? Why would her own family members drop dead beside the groom? Unless they were expendable, or never meant to die. A darker theory emerged from those who examined the timeline more closely. What if the poison had been meant for just a few? What if the casks were only meant to kill select targets, lords of the Varnava line and their closest retainers, and the dosage had gone catastrophically wrong? One alchemist suggested the mixture could have changed under temperature or age, becoming volatile when exposed to heat. A wedding hall filled with hundreds of candles, a roaring hearth, steaming dishes, it might have activated the dormant toxin, faster spreading it to all who drank. If true, then the massacre was a mistake. A mass murder born of miscalculation. A few intended deaths turned into an avalanche of corpses. But even that explanation felt hollow. Then came the letters. A tattered parchment, stained and half-burned, was discovered in the chamber of one of the castle scribes. It was addressed to a foreign duke. The contents were chilling, a coded message referencing the final harvest and toast that burned the bloodline clean. The handwriting matched that of a court advisor, one who had perished in the feast but whose loyalty had long been questioned. He had once served a rival king. Had he orchestrated the downfall of both houses to serve a third master? Or was the rot deeper? Some believed the crown itself, far removed from the Carpathian wilds, had grown weary of the Varnavas and their volatile alliances. Perhaps a shadow order sanctioned from the highest throne had intervened to reset the noble balance. No war, no battlefield. Just a banquet and a ghost. One chronicler dared to write. It was not poison that killed the nobles, it was politics. But even politics has its limits. This went beyond ambition, beyond revenge. The number of dead, the method, the message, it suggested something almost ceremonial. Among the 9 missing guests, one name stood out. A merchant named Elias the Quiet, known not for power or wealth, but for his peculiar habits. He never ate in public, traveled only at night, and was often seen near apothecaries, crypts, and abandoned churches. He vanished days after the wedding. Some said they saw him heading east toward lands where poisons are brewed like perfumes, where assassins speak in riddles and where bloodlines are seen not as sacred but as currency. Was Elias the agent? Or just another ghost? The deeper they looked, the more the facts crumbled. Records were missing. Witnesses fled or died. Servants recanted confessions. Even the names on the guest list changed. One copy said 80, another 75. A third listed 81. Who was the 81st guest who brought the chest? Why did some corpses decay faster than others? Why did the rats refuse to touch the wine-soaked bodies? It was a conspiracy wrapped in ritual revenge and the quiet horror of precision. It was not an act of passion. It was a performance meticulously planned, flawlessly executed. A royal bloodline was not simply murdered, it was deleted. And if it happened once, it could happen again. The logical explanations were crumbling, unraveling like old thread in shaking hands. Too many contradictions, too much that science could not contain. In the desperate search for answers, those who remained at Dragomir Castle, survivors, scribes, monks, even soldiers began to look not into ledgers or letters, but into something far older. Something darker. The whisper of a truth too dangerous for courtrooms or chronicles. The wine hadn't just killed, it transformed. Flesh warped, bones twisted. Some victims had claw marks on the inside of their mouths, as if something had tried to force its way out. One body preserved in a stone cellar by the cold was found days later with black veins crawling across the skin like roots. The physician who examined it claimed the heart had dissolved. He refused to touch another corpse and later hanged himself from the castle bell tower with a note that read, "This was not of man." The survivors began to speak of the cursed brew. Some claimed the wine had shimmered strangely, changing color beneath torchlight. A few remembered that it had no scent. A noblewoman who had tasted it and spat it out said it felt alive. Slippery, too thick. Others who drank only a sip and survived described visions, hallucinations of snakes coiling through the rafters of the bride floating above the table, her mouth dripping ink, whispering in a language no one recognized. The tapestries, ancient and dusty, were taken down to be cleaned after the disaster. Behind one hidden in stone, a symbol was found, a spiral etched into the wall surrounded by 6 circles. A local priest identified it as the mark of the Black Vine, a secret sect of occult alchemists long believed extinct. They were rumored to use poison as sacrament, combining herbs with forbidden rituals, seeking not to kill, but to cleanse. The symbol, he said, had last been seen carved into the bones of exhumed corpses in the eastern highlands a century prior. Legends about the Black Vine told of a recipe known as the Red Vintage, a formula of fermented blood venom and ash prepared under lunar alignment and meant to purge entire bloodlines considered unworthy. It wasn't just poison, it was judgment. Further examination of the castle's wine stores revealed one more anomaly, a wine goblet that appeared to have melted. Not broken melted. Its gold base was warped and fused to the table. No natural poison could do that, the alchemists insisted. Unless the goblet had been exposed to living fire, a mythical compound said to be used in alchemical transmutation. It was believed to cause metal to weep, glass to scream, and the human soul to fracture. A surviving monk came forward with a theory. The feast, he said, had been a ritual. A blood sacrifice hidden in plain sight. The wedding guests were not just victims, they were participants. The circle of nobles, the synchronized toast, the iron chest delivered by a faceless man, it all fit a pattern found in apocryphal texts about medieval blood rites. Some of the corpses, he pointed out, were positioned in geometric patterns as if arranged. Not by panicked survivors, but by something else. Something deliberate. The chest that had once held the poison was examined. Its interior was lined with black velvet, but under it were carving strange glyphs, half-faded, spiraling toward a central eye. A scholar from the West identified the markings as Proto-Slavic, possibly predating Christianity in the region. They referenced the seed that sings and the feast of endings. One symbol translated loosely to drink and forget your name. Another chilling detail surfaced from Dragomir's archives, almost missed during the chaos. A forgotten note in an old steward's ledger dated nearly 60 years earlier when the castle last hosted a grand feast. It read, Wine arrived from the east, sealed in black wax. 3 casks, not 4. 1 buried in the cellar until stars align again. That cellar was later found sealed. Inside it, empty casks long dried and a wall etched with hundreds of tiny scratches as if someone had been trapped within. Was this massacre a repetition of a previous event? Had the castle been the site of an older horror that history had tried to bury? Was this why Dragomir had gone decades without hosting a celebration? Even those who didn't believe in magic could not ignore the patterns. The deaths were too clean, the devastation too perfect. No ransom, no motive, no political body claiming responsibility. Instead, there was only silence and symbols. The few alchemists who remained at the castle grew uneasy. One fled in the night. Another claimed he'd begun to dream in symbols wake with blood in his mouth. A third was found dead, floating face down in the wine cellar, his fingers curled around a vial filled with dark red liquid. On the floor beside him, a warning scrawled in chalk, smeared but partially legible: "It is not the poison that kills. It is the memory." And that was the most terrifying thought of all. What if the wine didn't merely destroy the body, but changed those who drank it? What if it didn't kill the bloodline, but took it? The notion echoed through the halls long after the bodies were burned that something had been summoned that night, that the wedding feast wasn't the end of the Vernavas, but the beginning of something else, something that wears their faces, something that waits in silence, something that drinks. No royal court wants a massacre carved into its family tree. No king wants to admit that an entire noble house, one bound by blood lineage and sacred oath, was snuffed out by a glass of wine and a whispered curse. So they did what kings do best when history turns monstrous: they buried it. The first order came from the capital within days of the Dragomir massacre. A decree sealed with the royal crest was sent to all surrounding provinces. No public mention of the incident shall be permitted. Violators will be punished for sedition. Priests were warned to stop spreading rumors. Chroniclers were summoned, interrogated, and if their entries mentioned too many details, silenced. In monasteries, scribes were ordered to redact any record of the Varnava-Kelemen union. Marriage registers were altered. Genealogical scrolls had entire branches scraped clean. Pages were ripped out with trembling hands, ink bled over names once destined to rule. A few monks resisted. One was found crucified to his own writing desk. Another disappeared into the mountain passes carrying a single parchment etched in blood. His manuscript, later discovered in a hidden reliquary, bore one sentence: "I watched them choke and die, and still they smiled." Letters from foreign dignitaries who attended the wedding or planned to suddenly vanished. One ambassador who had fallen ill and left early wrote a detailed account to his king. The message never arrived. His entire escort drowned. While crossing a bridge on the return journey, the carriage swept into a gorge during what locals claimed was a sudden, unnatural storm. The ambassador's body was never found. Only his satchel was recovered, torn open, its pages missing. Dragomir Castle itself was quietly closed. Not sealed or burned, just left to rot. Guards were stationed at a distance. Supplies stopped being delivered. Roads leading to it faded into forest and mud. It became a ruin within months, overtaken by moss, echoing with birdsong and broken glass. Locals refused to go near it, claiming they heard music at night. Laughter, the clinking of goblets, and once a child's voice calling, "Please, not again." Among the few survivors, silence became survival. Some went mad. Others joined monasteries, took vows of silence, or changed their names entirely. The widow of a prominent baron was discovered years later working as a laundress in a fishing village, her hair white, her mouth stitched shut by her own hand. When questioned, she would only draw a spiral on the ground over and over until her fingers bled. One royal archivist, burdened by guilt, tried to preserve what little truth remained. He compiled fragments, letters, confessions, sketches into a single book, locked it in an iron chest, and sealed it beneath the palace library. Decades later, his successor discovered it by accident. He opened the chest. 2 days later, he leapt to his death from the bell tower, naked and raving, claiming the wine had followed him into his dreams. Most nations simply chose to forget. In Hungary, the event was transformed into a cautionary folktale, The Feast of Bitter Vows, a moral story told to children about gluttony, betrayal, and cursed weddings. The Varnava name became taboo, its meaning lost to time, preserved only in the twisted lullabies sung by shepherds and drunkards. One rhyme persisted for generations. Raise your glass and speak no lie, or the red wine sings and you will die. Bride in silk and groom in ash, kiss the cup and feel the lash. In some corners of Europe, Dragomir became myth, a ghost story, a whispered legend among noble houses. Guard your toast, they'd say, or you'll wake the vines. But scattered across the continent, evidence remained. An unmarked grave in Bohemia containing 5 bodies dressed in royal garb, no names, no cause of death. A Venetian letter mentioning the red wine that burned through generations. A preserved goblet held in a private collection in Krakow, etched with strange spiral designs and pitted as though by acid. When a historian examined it in the early 1800s, she collapsed after touching it, her skin erupting in boils. She survived but never spoke again. Even the Vatican held secrets. Deep within its forbidden archives, beneath layers of heretical documents and cursed scrolls, exists a parchment dated 1374. It bears a seal never used again. Written in Latin, it reads, "An entire house was taken, not by sword nor plague, but by chalice. Seal the knowledge, burn the tongues." The church did just that. Every mention of the Varnava-Kelemen wedding was expunged from papal records. When questioned centuries later, Vatican officials denied the house ever existed. There is no record, they said. There was no wedding, but memory is stubborn. It survives in shadows and whispers, in paintings hung in forgotten quarters, in portraits with the eyes scratched out. The Dragomir massacre was not erased, it was interred, buried beneath so much silence that even the soil recoils from the truth. And yet the fear remains. Fear not just of what happened, but of why no one dares speak of it. Because what if the wine wasn't just poison? What if it was a message long after the fires died out, and the bodies became ash in the frozen soil around Dragomir? The fear remained. It didn't matter that the Varnava name had been erased, that the royal scribes had rewritten history, or that the castle lay in silent ruin. Something about the massacre haunted Europe not as memory but as instinct. A whisper that curled around every banquet hall and flickered in the eyes of every noble who dared raise a glass in celebration. From the 15th century onward, royal courts across the continent quietly changed their traditions. Wine testers became not just ceremonial but essential. Tasting cups made of silver, once a novelty, became law. Food tasters were no longer peasants, they were trained alchemists, physicians, monks sworn to purity. Whole disciplines arose around toxicology, not for the masses, but for the elite. The wealthy began dining behind locked doors. Feasts were shorter menus, standardized, and elaborate drinks fell out of favor. In France, a decree was issued forbidding toasts at state weddings unless the wine was uncorked and tested in front of at least 3 witnesses. In Austria, entire kitchens were built underground away from prying eyes, staffed by family-only servants bound by oath and blood. In Hungary, a royal wedding in 1483 was famously delayed because a single barrel of wine arrived unsealed. It was burned on the spot along with the merchant who delivered it. Even the architecture of castles began to change. Banquet halls were designed with escape routes. Cellars were redesigned with surveillance alcoves. Some families carved wards into the wood above their dining tables, symbols of protection borrowed from pre-Christian cults. Old fears wore new faces. The phrase Dragomir toast became code among nobles. If someone said it at a gathering, it meant don't drink. More than one political rival was quietly warned this way, their lives likely spared by an old legend no one dared forget. Artists, too, preserved the fear in secret. A 16th century Flemish painting. The Crimson Wedding shows a noble feast in mid-ruined goblets, tipped blood spilling across roast game dancers collapsed in agony. There are no names, no historical reference, but in the background, carved faintly into a pillar, is the spiral and 6 circles. Scholars who analyzed the painting noted that the eyes of the bride appear to follow the viewer. Some claim if you look too long, you'll taste iron in your mouth. But perhaps the most chilling echo of Dragomir came in 1782 during a quiet excavation of a forgotten chapel in the Carpathian foothills. Hidden behind the altar beneath layers of stone was a sealed vault. Inside, bones, dozens of them arranged in a circle, hands extended toward the center. At the center lay a goblet intact, its contents evaporated but the scent still lingering. A mixture of copper cloves and something bitter. The archaeologist in charge refused to publish the findings. His journal, discovered years later, ended with one entry: the wine was never meant to kill. It was meant to remember. Centuries have passed. Wars have come and gone. Thrones have risen and crumbled. But one truth remains constant: every royal family still fears the cup. And every feast, no matter how joyful, carries a shadow. So the next time you raise your glass at a wedding, a birthday, a celebration, ask yourself, do you know who poured it? Do you know what's inside? Would you still drink? If the wine remembered you, if this story haunted you, share it. Let the forgotten speak again. And subscribe for more chilling tales buried by time, hidden by power, and soaked in blood. What you've heard today is just one among many. History doesn't always scream. Sometimes it toasts. Until next time, stay curious and stay careful.